On the morning of June 4th, 1942, a Marine Corps captain named Kirk Armistead sat in the cockpit of a fighter that the Navy had spent 3 years making worse. That was not how he saw it. He just knew the controls felt wrong. The stick was heavy. The nose wanted to drop. The radar tower on Midway had just lit up with the worst possible news. Over 100 Japanese aircraft inbound, fast. Armistead was one of the pilots who made it back that morning. Most of his squadron did not. Later, after the smoke cleared and the reports were written, he described exactly what it felt like to meet a wave of zeros in a machine that could not climb, could not turn, and could not run. His words were careful and quiet, which made them harder to read than if he had just been angry. The plane Armistead flew that day was a Brewster F-2A3 Buffalo. You have probably heard it called the worst American fighter of the war, a flying coffin, a beer barrel with wings. The internet loves that story. What the internet skips is the engineering story underneath it. The F-2A3 that sat on the runway at Midway was not the plane Brewster originally designed. It was 3 years of Navy orders, rush changes, and factory shortcuts had turned it into. By the time it reached the Marines of VMF 221, something very specific had gone wrong inside that airframe. Something that made the battle a foregone conclusion before the first trigger was pulled. That is what we're getting into today. Forget the catchphrases. Let us look at what actually happened to this plane.
You're watching World War II Air Command.
To understand what went wrong, you have to start with what the Buffalo actually was before the changes started piling up. In 1938, the F-2A1 was a genuine step forward for the U.S. Navy. It was the first all-metal monoplane fighter the Navy ever accepted. Before it, the Navy was still flying fabric-covered biplanes. The F-2A1 had a closed cockpit, wheels that folded up into the belly, and a clean metal skin held together with flush rivets. For its time, it was a serious piece of work. The detail that usually gets buried is how well those early versions actually flew. When Finland bought the export variant in 1940, they received a slightly different machine. Brewster stripped out all the naval equipment, the tail hooks, the life raft containers, and delivered a lighter, cleaner airframe designated the B-239. The Finnish pilots loved it. They called it the Sky Pearl. During the continuation war against the Soviet Union, which ran from 1941 into 1944, Finnish B-239s claimed 477 Soviet aircraft destroyed against just 19 of their own lost, a kill ratio of 25-1. That is not a bad airplane. That is a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. The reason it worked so well in Finnish hands came down to one thing. The weight was right. The B-239 came in at just under 3,800 pounds empty, and its Wright Cyclone radial engine put out 950 horsepower. For 1940, that combination gave the plane a sharp rate of climb and enough maneuverability to stay competitive. It also had no self-sealing fuel tanks, no cockpit armor, and none of the heavy additions the U.S. Navy would later demand. It was light because nothing unnecessary had been bolted onto it yet. The question worth sitting with is, how you get from that to what happened at Midway. The answer is not one bad decision. It is 24 small ones, each made by people who never had to fly the result. The Navy Bureau of Aeronautics was watching the air war in Europe with real worry. Every report coming back from France and Britain made it clear that the old assumptions about fighter design were costing lives. Pilots needed armor behind their seats. Fuel tanks needed to seal themselves when hit. Fighters needed more range for the open ocean. All of that was true. The problem was how those demands landed at the Brewster factory. Brewster was not built for this kind of pressure. The company had started out making horse carriages, moved into car bodies, and only recently gotten into airplane manufacturing. They did not have the engineering infrastructure that a company like Grumman had. When the Navy sent down a new requirement, Brewster's answer was almost always the same. Add it on, stretch the body, bolt in a bracket, reinforce the frame. The underlying structure of the plane was never rebuilt from scratch to handle all the extra load. It just kept getting heavier piece by piece. The F-2A2 model had already brought in a heavier version of the engine, the Wright R-182040, putting out 1,200 horsepower, which added weight up front and required a bigger, heavier cowling to contain it. Whatever speed that engine gained, part of it got eaten up just by the weight of installing it. Then came the F-2A3, the version that ended up at Midway. The Navy wanted a fighter that could fly long patrols over open water. That meant more fuel. The fuselage was stretched several inches just forward of the firewall to fit a bigger fuel tank. That meant the frame had to be reinforced so the nose would not twist under engine torque. Every fix created a new problem, and nobody was keeping a running total of how much it added to the overall weight. By 1941, the changes had stacked up into something serious. Steel armor plates went in directly behind the cockpit seat to protect the pilot from bullets coming from behind. thick armored glass went onto the front windscreen. Both were smart ideas based on real combat experience. Both were heavy. Neither one had been planned for when the plane was first designed, so there was no extra strength built into the frame to carry them cleanly. The fuel tank situation made things worse in a way nobody expected. The Navy wanted self-sealing tanks, meaning the rubber inside the tank walls would swell shut if a bullet punched through, stopping a fire before it started. Good idea. The problem was that the rubber lining was thick and took up a lot of space inside the wing. The tanks actually held less fuel after the change than before. To make up for that, engineers added more tankage in other spots, which added more weight. They were going in circles by the time a fully loaded F-2A3 sat on the runway at Midway with a pilot, ammunition, and a full fuel load. It was pushing toward its maximum takeoff weight of over 7,100 pounds. The early export model the fins were flying had a maximum takeoff weight closer to 5,000 pounds. That is not a small difference. That is over a ton worth of difference. Wing loading shows exactly what that meant in practice. Wing loading is just the weight of the plane divided by the size of its wings. It tells you how hard the wings are working to keep the thing in the air. The early Buffalo had a wing loading around 24 pounds per square foot. The F-2A3 at Midway was over 34 pounds per square foot. The higher that number gets, the harder it is to turn. The faster the plane runs out of speed in a tight bank, and the more runway it needs to get off the ground. The sharpness that made the fins love the plane was gone. The total weight was bad enough. Where that weight was sitting made things even worse. Every airplane has a balance point called the center of gravity. If that point shifts too far forward, the nose pulls down on its own. If it shifts too far back, the plane gets twitchy and hard to control. The F-2A3 had pushed its balance point too far forward because so much of the new weight, the armored glass, the heavier engine, the bigger fuel tank was all packed into the front half of the plane to stop the nose from dropping on its own. The engineers had to adjust the tail so it was pushing down constantly just to hold the plane level. That sounds simple, but it means the tail is always fighting against the wings. The plane is generating aerodynamic drag just to stay straight, burning energy it should be using to fly fast. Pilots flying the F-2A3 said the controls felt stiff and sluggish, especially at speed. Pulling out of a dive was a two-handed job. In a turning fight, where a half-second reaction matters, that kind of heaviness in the stick was a real problem. There was another issue. When Armistead and the other VMF 221 pilots tried to pull a hard turn to get on a zero or shake one off their tail, the heavy nose would swing through the turn wrong. The airflow over the wings would break apart at exactly the wrong moment, and the plane would snap into a spin, what pilots call a departure stall. At low altitude, there was no time to recover. A plane designed to be nimble had been turned into something that fought back when you pushed it. The weight was not just hurting performance in the air, it was physically damaging the plane on the ground. The landing gear was the clearest sign. The landing gear on the Buffalo was hydraulically actuated, meaning fluid pressure pushed through a set of lines to fold the wheels up into the belly and lower them again. That system was sized for a much lighter aircraft making carrier landings, soft arrests on a moving deck at sea. When a heavily loaded F-2A3 came down hard on the Coral runway at Midway, the metal struts in the gear took a beating they were not designed for. The metal parts were cracking and bending regularly in the weeks leading up to the battle. Ground crews were welding scrap metal onto the struts just to keep the planes from collapsing while they taxied. There are records from May 1942 showing exactly that kind of patching happening on the flight line. The climb rate was the other serious problem, and in a combat situation, it mattered more than anything else. When the radar station at Midway picked up the Japanese strike coming in at 5:55 in the morning, the Buffaloes had maybe 15 minutes to get airborne and climb to a useful altitude. The F-2A3's published climb rate was around 2,440 feet per minute under ideal conditions. June in the Pacific is not ideal conditions. Heat and humidity pull power out of a piston engine, and these planes were already worn from weeks of hard use on a Coral runway. The Zeros escorting the Japanese strike were already above 15,000 feet and still climbing when the Marines scrambled. The Zeros were light. The Zero's engine was well matched to its weight. When the Marines of VMF 221 finally leveled off, the Japanese fighters were already higher and had the sun at their backs. The fight had already been decided by physics before a single shot was fired. Kirk Armistead pulled his F-2A3 into a climb and looked up at the Zeros and knew the battle that followed was not a fair fight by any measure, but the unfairness was not just about numbers. VMF 221 put 25 aircraft into the air that morning, a mix of Buffaloes and a handful of Grumman Wildcats. The pilots who flew them were trained, aggressive, and ready to fight. What they found out in the first few seconds of contact was that the plane itself had already made the decision for them. Armistead later reported sighting the enemy at around 14,000 feet, 5 to 7 miles out from the atoll, and immediately understood the situation. The Zeros were above him and coming down with speed and altitude on their side. The physical limits of the F-2A3 made the outcome irreversible. A hard climb meant stalling out. A loop meant hanging in the air long enough for a Zero to line up a clean shot. The only move that made sense was to push the nose down, use the weight for speed, and dive toward the anti-aircraft guns protecting the island. Some of them made it, most did not. 15 of the 25 aircraft were lost in the engagement. Of those that got back to the runway, most were so badly shot up they were written off on the spot. The pilot reports filed after the battle were blunt. The men were not complaining about the odds or the tactics. They were describing a machine that had already failed them before the fight began. Armistead survived. He kept flying after Midway. His account of that morning is steady and factual. It describes a pilot doing exactly what he was trained to do in a plane that had already settled the outcome before he even rolled onto the runway. The simple version of this story is that the Buffalo was a bad plane. That version is also wrong. The F-2A3 that flew at Midway started out as a solid 1938 design. The Navy procurement system spent 3 years piling requirements onto it, each one reasonable on its own, contradictory when taken all together. The armor made sense, the self-sealing tanks made sense, the extra fuel made sense. Nobody stopped to ask whether the plane that carried all of it could still do the thing it was originally purchased to do. There is no single person to blame for that. It was a system that treated weight as someone else's problem, applied to a manufacturer that did not have the experience to say no, directed by a bureau that kept changing the target without ever going back to check the foundation. The men of VMF 221 paid for that on the morning of June 4th. Next week, episode 2 goes back inside that cockpit for a different kind of failure. When pilots pushed the right cyclone to full power in a hard climbing turn, a flaw in the engine breather system sent oil migrating forward until it coated the inside of the windscreen. In a dogfight at altitude, that meant flying completely blind. We will get into exactly how that happened and what the pilots tried to do about it. The full documentary on the Buffalo story is linked in the description if you the full story. As always, fight smart, fly home.